Welcome and good evening. This is the public meeting where we're going to talk about the Neponset River Watershed Association and our municipal vulnerability project grant with our regional partners. So my name is Karen Gross-Horan. I am the community engagement strategist with NEPRA, and we're really pleased to have you with us. This is a general overview of where we'll go tonight. We'll have some overviews about climate impact in the Neponset region. We'll talk about the project and the activity and goals that have been underway for a number of years. We'll talk about the modeling that's projected in our region for flooding and how we are prioritizing interventions. There'll be a Q&A, and then we'll talk about the flood maps. From there, there'll be an opportunity to break out into 3 regional breakout rooms, depending on where you live or work, or you're interested in hearing more about the specific flooding, and we'll give you details about choosing your breakout room based on where you want to learn more about the flood maps. We'll have a discussion in that breakout room, and then we'll come back together to go over next steps and where we will wrap up. So with that, I'll go to our public meeting norms. We ask that you be respectful of others and of our time together as we discuss these important topics. We ask that there be no disruptive behavior. It is not welcome in this forum, and we will make moves to remove any disruptors or any untoward behavior. And the third would be, while there may be wide-ranging opinions about climate science in our world today, our agenda tonight is about making our communities more resilient to the worsening storms and extreme weather, and not to have a debate about whether climate change is real or not. So we appreciate everyone respecting this focus tonight. With that, I will introduce our project team, which is in addition to Neponset River Watershed Association, Weston and Sampson Engineering, Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and these towns that are in our watershed, with Dedham being our fiscal agent, City of Boston, Boston Water and Sewer, Town of Canton, Foxborough, Medfield, Milton, Norwood, City of Quincy, towns of Sharon, Stoughton, Walpole, and Westwood. And though our watershed touches small parts of Avon and Randolph, they are not part of this project per se. With that, I will introduce my colleague and Managing Director of Community Resilience at NEPRA, Carrie Snyder.
Thank you, Karen. And I just wanted to make note that this project is made possible through a grant, a state grant through the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. And so we are very grateful to them and to Dedham for shepherding this project through.
Carrie, can I just interrupt for one thing?
Yes.
I forgot to note a few things about our logistics in the meeting. The session is recorded. The breakout sessions will not be recorded. And we ask that you direct your questions to Sean in the chat for Q&A. Otherwise, the chat will be limited. Any questions we're not able to answer during this session, we'll have a response for in a follow-up email to participants, and that will include a recording of the session as well. So thank you. I'm sorry about that.
No, thank you. All right, so let's dive right in. So I wanted to start by talking about what changes we're already experiencing and what we can expect in the future, as well as the consequences of those changes to our climate and what it might mean for residents throughout the watershed. So what climate change is at its basic level is a global warming of temperatures. And that rise in temperature has complex impacts across the world. In our region, we're going to see the changes at our extremes. We'll still have variable temperatures and seasons, but we're already experiencing certain notable changes. For one, we are noticing changes in precipitation patterns. We're seeing more of our rain come down as heavy downpours rather than spread out across the year in lighter rainfalls. We're experiencing more frequent heat waves, and heat waves are a number of days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. We're experiencing more severe storms accompanied by high winds, and we're experiencing sea level rise, which is contributing to coastal flooding. Um, and as we talk
Carrie,
about,
could you get your volume up a bit?
sure. All right, I'm gonna have to try to just talk louder because it's up as high as it can go. Um, So one thing I want to note as we talk about some of these climate impacts and the consequences of these impacts is that not everyone is affected the same way when it comes to climate change. If we look at heat, for example, local temperature is going to be much higher in a more urban, developed neighborhood with lots of paved surfaces and buildings than it will be in a leafy suburban neighborhood. Additionally, certain people are impacted disproportionately. Those who are less able to get out of the way, those who are less able to bounce back after a disruption or loss of resources, and we'll be touching on those as we move forward. So first, let's talk about public health. So the consequences of these climate impacts are multifaceted. With public health, more heat waves means lower air quality, particularly in built environments like urban and suburban neighborhoods. It disproportionately affects some residents. The most vulnerable are children, seniors, and those who work outdoors. We might see schools closing more days because it's too hot to be in a classroom, loss of work days due to illness. Flooding might cause sanitary sewer backups and pollute local waterways. And what if those heat waves are further exacerbated by things like power outages and interfering with medical equipment or people's ability to stay in their homes? So those are the sort of consequences that we think about when we are looking at these issues. We also need to worry about infrastructure damage. Changes to precipitation patterns are leading to more flooding as well as more drought. And this will stress infrastructure, including roads, culverts which were generally not built to manage the amount of water that's falling during these heavy storms. Dams, many of which are abandoned and in disrepair. Public transportation systems, utility service, and access to resources like food, childcare, and medical services. Public safety and property damage. With heat waves and windstorms, flooding and drought, we see increases in risk of wildfire, damage to homes from downed trees, interference with public safety's ability to get to where they need to go, and flooding in homes and causing personal property damages. And then there's also the ecological consequences. Sewage overflows into drinking water resources and recreational areas are going to affect everybody. Changing seasons might allow, vectors of diseases like mosquitoes and ticks to thrive in new places or for longer periods of time. And with a reduction in physical habitat and habitat quality, we might see impacts to fish and wildlife. So these are all caused by the changes that we're seeing in climate change, and these are the things we'd like to minimize these consequences for everybody in the region. So that brings us to our project. This is we've named it the Resilient Neponset project, and through it, all of our communities have come together to work together to plan and talk about ways to minimize the consequences for our residents and small businesses, as well as our environment. The overview of this project, so we're in phase 2 of this project, year 3 of the entire project, and it's got a couple of components. One is we've developed with Weston Sampson and our communities a watershed-wide flood model to identify areas most at risk for future flooding, given what we expect the rainfall to be. And Weston Sampson will talk about some of that data in a moment. Weston Sampson is going to look at some priority neighborhoods that might benefit from nature-based solutions to mitigate some of that flood risk. We've brought our municipal staff together in a municipal climate collaborative to work together to come up with a plan on how to work together for regional solutions, because these impacts are not stopping at municipal boundaries. It's region-wide, it's Commonwealth-wide, and so we need to be looking at these issues together rather than separately within our own borders. We've assembled a community advisory group from across the watershed to find out what residents and small businesses are most concerned about, what education needs there are, and how we can empower people to become more involved with their municipal officials at the planning stages of some of these interventions. And finally, we're helping with community education. Again, taking those ideas from the community advisory group and others that we've heard from the community, and providing some education so people feel informed and able to participate in these projects. And then one last thing I'll touch on is we are most concerned in this project with adapting to the changes that are already coming our way. When we talk about climate change, we talk about mitigating climate change and reducing greenhouse gases to reduce the severity of climate change. But we also need to talk about building resilience and mitigating, adapting to the changes that are already in motion and that are already here. So both of these things need to be done together, and our focus has been on the adaptation side. So I just wanted to make that clear. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues at Weston & Sampson.
Thank you, Carrie. That's great. We appreciate everyone's time tonight. It's nice to meet you all. I'm Jenny Moonen. I'm a senior project manager at Weston & Sampson Engineers, and I have with me Indrani Ghosh, who is resilience practice leader. And with that, Indrani is going to go over some of the model basics, and then we will get into what we're really working on. And as a reminder, as you have questions, please add them to the chat.
Thanks a lot, Jenny. As Carrie mentioned, this project is really all about understanding how we prepare ourselves as a community, as a watershed, to the extreme rainfall patterns that some of which we are already experiencing, some of which we are likely to experience with greater intensity and more frequency in the future under changing climate patterns. This is a slide that some of you all may be familiar with from the past work that we have done and presented on this project. But really, what we are seeing in terms of the best available climate change data and projections that have been adopted by the state of Massachusetts is that the storms that we are experiencing are likely to be more intense and more frequent. So, for example, the 25-year storm of today is likely to be the 10-year storm by 2050. The 500-year storm of today is likely to be the 100-year storm by 2070. And these are the projections that have been adopted by the Commonwealth, and they have been recently developed by Cornell University as best available future projections for the New England region. In the next slide, what we are showing is really the significance of doing this work at the watershed scale. So expanding on what Carrie said at the beginning, it's helpful to understand what is a watershed. It is an area of land that drains to the same water body, in this case, the Neponset River. And it's important to understand why we need to do this at a watershed scale, because some of the towns in the watershed, some of you all have developed models for individual communities. So why do we need a regional one? And that the reason is that water does not respect municipal boundaries. So what happens in Stoughton may affect Canton. What happens in Dedham can affect Boston. And so understanding the risks and the causes of flooding at a watershed scale really helps us identify solutions as well at the watershed scale. So the next slide sort of gives a bit of a snippet of the work that has been done to date. But again, I'd kind of like recap what is a model. What is, in this case, we're talking about a hydrologic and hydraulic model, which is a mathematical simulation of what happens when it rains as it relates to how much of that rain translates into runoff and how much infiltrates to the ground. So this model is really intended to represent where precipitation goes, how long it hangs around in the built and natural environment that can affect our daily lives, and then how much of that can be predicted and what happens under a variety of rainfall events. And so really it gives a representation of where flooding happens now and where it can be expected to occur in the future as a result of climate change. And we can also use the model to evaluate the efficacy of flood reduction strategies. So we developed this model to capture the over 117 square miles. It models the main stem of the Neponset River as well as the tributaries here are listed. We're also modeling and simulating various dams and culverts across the watershed. And this model continues to be developed and updated as we speak through the phases that it was built in 2022 through now current as it is being updated and being used for identifying projects. The next slide gives a really a quick overview of the different of the processes that was developed to used to develop the model. A model is oftentimes said as good as the data that goes into it. So we used existing rain gauges and flow gauges across the watershed at various locations. These are USGS stream gauges that were used to calibrate the model, as well as to validate it. It was calibrated to the storm of March 2010, which was one of the longer duration storms in this New England area, which some of you may remember and caused a lot of flooding damage. And the model has been calibrated to that and has been validated to more recent storm events, such as the one in 2018, as well as the Hurricane Ida, which occurred in September of 2021. This next slide here shows a summary of the different types of rainstorms and rainfall events that have been evaluated through the model. We have looked at a variety of storm events that range in frequency from the more frequent storm events, such as the 2-year storm, to the more extreme and less frequent storm events, such as the 100-year storm. And we have looked at a variety of conditions, such as the present day, as well as the 2050 and interim and the 2070 planning horizons. And the rainfall totals are listed here. The next slide here basically shows the results of the flood model. And so what happens, and so it's important to remember that these are the results of flooding that we are expected to experience across this watershed if no action is taken. So if no action is taken, approximately more than 1,085 acres of additional area are likely to be flooded across the watershed. From a 10-year storm by 2070 compared to a 10-year storm of today. So while Super Bowl is fresh in everyone's mind, what is that? 1,085 acres of land actually is equivalent to approximately 822 football fields across the watershed that are likely to be flooded. If we look at what that means in terms of flood volume, again, that is equivalent to approximately 2,435 million gallons of additional runoff volume that across the watershed we would experience if no action is taken. And that is a 67% increase in the volume of flooding that we would see in the 10-year storm by 2070 compared to the present day. So we said that was equivalent to 822 football fields that would be flooded additional. Now imagine those football fields have approximately 7 feet deep of water. That is how much that 2,435 million gallons of flooding translates to. And that is how much flood volumes we would have to manage as a watershed in the future if we were to do nothing. And with that, Jenny's going to speak a little bit about the impacts on critical infrastructure facilities.
Yeah, one of the things we've done this year is taken a really hard look at what we call critical assets or critical infrastructure, critical facilities. These are, these are the places that we rely on for services in our everyday lives and everyday needs, as well as in an emergency, right? So thinking about fire and police and pharmacies and supermarkets, as well as communications and our municipal facilities that we would maybe go to if there was, an emergency. So there's significant number of critical assets. You can see the list of categories on the left, almost 4,290 that we identified working in collaboration with the communities. And the map on the right shows sort of I would call it the blue dots are the locations of those facilities throughout the watershed. You can see how they are, get denser when you get a little bit more into the urbanized area of the watershed. But if you go to the next slide, you can see the impact of potential flooding on those. So this lists each community that has a portion of its land mass in the watershed, how many critical assets were identified in that community. And like I said, those were developed in conjunction with the communities and publicly available data from the state. The third column is showing if there's no action taken, presently, this is how many would be in the floodplain based on the modeling that's available. And the the fourth column shows in 2070, if no action's taken, how many assets now are in the flood zone. And the final column is showing the increase from now to 2070. And you can see, right, Boston, there's an increase of 8. There's Milton has an increase of 32. Norwood has an increase of 4 assets. I'm not going to read them all, but what we're getting at here is it did give us a chance to really look at this and understand spatially how will flooding potentially affect, these resources for our communities, and looking at these in conjunction with prioritizing areas for further study, as well as, thinking about potential flood reduction strategies. Next slide. What can we do to reduce flooding? There's a number of strategies, right? You can think about this in terms of green infrastructure, which is infrastructure that is meant to kind of capture rain or snow melt where it falls and hold it back and put it back in the ground. It has other co-benefits that I'll get into, but these are things like rain gardens and bioswales, which basically are taking away our impervious cover or the areas that are paved, and hardscapes in our area, in our landscape. Next slide. We can put in pervious pavement. Folks may have seen this, right? You can have pavers, you can have overflow parking, and you can even have permeable pavement that looks just like normal pavement, but water flows right through it, like the image in the middle. We can create places to store more water when it floods, like floodable parks and fields, or constructing wetlands areas. And we can create more storage. Folks may have rain barrels at their own houses, like the image on the far left. There are also, industrial ways to do that as well, like the image in the middle. And on the right, you'll see an image of subsurface storage, which is very common in areas with certain types of soils where you can actually put the water underground and hold it back during the storm and then allow it to infiltrate as well and get back into the ground. And then we can combine solutions. We have practices we call, green streets, and when you're thinking about a whole neighborhood or a whole area, you might have a bunch of these practices tied together. You might have pipes and underground storage with trees and bioswales and rain gardens all combined to create a system that's going to manage small storms up to big storms. And the green solutions have many additional benefits. They can improve water quality, reduce temperatures, create habitat. They can, they're visually pleasing. They can be recreation and placemaking opportunities, etc. So we see a lot of good benefit from what we consider to be sort of green practices. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Indrani to talk about the last piece that we're working on this year about really prioritizing these interventions I've spoken about, and how do we find the best places in the watershed, like the most bang for the buck.
Yep, thank you, Jenny. So last year, we really used the model to identify where or to identify the most effective strategy that would benefit from the types of solutions that Jenny discussed. So where would we see the most benefit in terms of flood reduction by increasing impervious storage, by increasing pervious storage, by decreasing impervious area? With that information that we had from last year's work, this year, we're using that knowledge of the way that the different portions of the watershed respond to different types of solutions. We're using that information to help guide, to rank the catchments and help guide communities where we would need to spend time and resources on developing the most effective and efficient flood mitigation strategies that would not only have a local flood reduction benefit, but would also have a watershed scale flood reduction benefit. So in building off the work again that we did in last year, we're identifying catchments to prioritize those flood mitigation projects. And we really conducted a more extensive effort to identify catchments within the larger watershed that might benefit most from using green infrastructure, as well as finding opportunities where green infrastructure can be doubled up with gray solutions as applicable. And this prioritization work really revolved around scoring each of the 180 catchments on a number of metrics. But the three guiding questions that we used to identify catchments in order to prioritize flood mitigation projects were the following three. We were looking at to what extent flooding is a problem in those areas, and what are those impacts that Jenny mentioned related to critical infrastructure in those areas. So how big of a problem flooding is in that area? That was one of the key questions we looked at. Question two that we looked at was really how effective are solutions to mitigate that flooding that we are observing in those areas. In other words, the work that we did in the prior phases, where we tried to hone in what types of flood mitigation strategies would be effective in reducing that flooding, how effective were those solutions? So in particular areas. And so we tried to look at that in identifying those priority catchments. And then the third question really was to identify how feasible is the implementation. In other words, you know, how likely would you be able to get that project designed, built, and constructed, and what would that look like in different locations of the watershed? Those were really the three key leading questions that we were looking at. And we'll go through the next few slides, just covering a little bit more about each of those questions. So next slide is on that first question related to how severe is the flooding and how severe are the associated impacts. And those impacts we were assessing with respect to impacts on increase in flooded area, impacts on critical infrastructure, impacts on buildings per se, and then of course impacts on environmental justice and climate vulnerable population groups across the watershed. When we looked at these impacts, what we were considering were really sort of what is most sensitive to what is, we used a graded scale of identifying the impacts and looking at what's more sensitive versus less sensitive. So increase in inundation area or impacts to critical infrastructure, if you are already seeing the impacts today, those are likely areas that are more sensitive and would need more attention. And then if you were only going to see some of those impacts in the future, that is also something that will need to be considered. But sort of when we ranked catchments, we were looking at the imminence of the impact, and hence we gave a higher score to catchments that were more impacted from storms of today, and then we gave comparatively lower scores to catchments that are likely to be impacted in the future. The next question that we looked at was how effective are those solutions going to be? How effective are those catchments going to be to those solutions that we have been evaluating in prior phase as well as in last year? And we assessed that with respect to local flood volume. And when we were looking at how effective the strategies that Jenny discussed were going to be to the flood impacts, we looked at not just flooding within the catchment, but we also looked at flooding in upstream areas, because the benefit of this approach is at that watershed scale, keeping in mind local flood mitigation benefits as well. And then the third criteria that we looked at was that feasibility of implementation in for each of those nature-based solutions in the priority catchments. And that included how much available impervious area is in the watershed. That excludes the buildings, right? Because that is where we would be able to work with that available land or available area to design and build some of those flood mitigation solutions, both green and gray. How much municipal land is available? How much of that land is unprotected open space, because we can't be doing anything in conservation land? How much of that available space has good type of soils that would allow for infiltration and that would allow for us to design green infrastructure and nature-based solutions? So those were the three key questions that we looked at. And really that brings us to the last takeaway slide of the work that we have done to date. Really, there is an absolute understanding of the fact that flood impacts are likely to worsen in the future. We're already seeing some acute and chronic impacts from flooding across the watershed. Where and when it floods will depend on where we are in the watershed, because the impacts are not being felt similarly across the entire Neponset River watershed. And there are actions that we can take to mitigate the flooding, which is the good news, right? So the model helped us identify where we can hone in those actions that will provide sort of the best return, best bang for the buck, best return on our investment in terms of our resources as a community and as a watershed. And then understanding that significant flood reduction is really sort of an all hands on deck approach, that changes would need to be made across all communities. No single community can solve this, and hence on their own, and hence this is really a watershed scale approach to solutions. And also that municipal and state projects will play an important role. It's really the partnerships that we're talking about. Again, no single entity can solve this. It has to be a coming together of municipal, state, and private property owners as well to solve the problem related to this extreme flood volume and volumes of flooding that we would have to manage. And with that, I think, Carrie, we're opening it up for questions. Sean, if there are questions that have come in the chat.
Yes, we are.
All right. Yep. So we've got a few questions. The first is from Maria Lyons. The statistics you showed in the beginning of the presentation only reflect stormwater flooding, not coastal flooding. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. The flooding that we are assessing as part of this project relates to flooding from precipitation-driven flooding, and that is flooding from both riverine flooding as well as flooding from stormwater infrastructure, or pluvial flooding, stormwater flooding.
Okay. And then a few questions from Jerry Hopcroft. So the concept question basically about how quickly water gets to the river. And he pointed out that in your presentation, hang on, I just want to get it right. More than half the waterways are pipes and conduits that connect to the river. How does that affect the speed and volume of flow in the river itself and its tributaries, and the rate at which the water actually gets to the river from the streets it's diverted off? And I don't know if we want to break that into one question, or also ask what would be the effect of how fast the water gets to the river if those conduits were either enlarged or diverted into other places like retention ponds. And Jerry, if I mangled your question, please feel free to come off chat.
That was pretty close.
Yes, so there were, I feel like there were many nested questions in between, and I may not have the exact specific answers to all the data that you may be looking for. We have accounted for the different piped conduits, the closed channel, the piped infrastructure or the stormwater conduits, as well as the open channel, that is the Neponset River. So we factored both in. We have noticed that the time of concentration, meaning the amount of time that it takes for a rainwater to get into the pipe, is in an urbanized setting, as you can expect, is very short. It could be less than a minute, but then it does take time for rainwater to move from a less urbanized portion of the watershed to the downstream end of the watershed. And the model does account that time of concentration, which varies across the different portions of the watershed based on imperviousness, land use, topography, soil type as well. So we have factored all of those in as part of, and those parameters are all available, as part of model inputs, as well as model outputs as well, across the watershed. Your question about how the floodwaters, attenuation of the floodwaters, of the peak of the flood can occur. If that were to be changed, I think that is really where also our solutions are directed at. So when we are decreasing impervious cover, as well as adding more storage underneath impervious cover, or adding more storage underneath pervious cover, we're sort of slowing down the floodwaters and attenuating the peak from occurring at the same time. And that leads to reduction in flood volume and flood extents across the watershed.
Great.
If I may, John,
Yeah, go ahead.
just follow up that a little bit. My question really also relates to the fact that conduits will fill and overfill, and therefore, if we can daylight a lot of those conduits, probably not all of them, but a lot of them, we should be able to reduce that slowness in the watershed and move the water to the river faster. Now that hydrograph comes up very quickly already in the Neponset, at least at the northward end. I don't know how much more the river can handle, but we're still able to use the adjacent areas along the airport for recreation when it's up around 15 feet on the gauge. We're designing water crossings for 11 feet on the gauge, which means 85% of the time, the river should stay within its boundary already. So I think that allowing it to go out of the boundary in order to reduce flooding elsewhere may be valuable. I was just wondering how much effort and thought has been put into those concepts. Thank
Yep. The grant funding that we've been given is mostly focused on nature-based solutions. So we're thinking mostly about how we can sort of put nature back into the built environment, and we are not looking as closely at the gray solutions you're talking about, right? Upsizing pipes, opening conduits. This year, we're going to be looking at 6 targeted areas that we're getting to from the analysis Indrani spoke of. And in those areas, we're going to be considering any possible ways to reduce flooding, whether that's detention, whether that's daylighting, whether that's changing culverts, whether that's green solutions, whether that's underground storage, right? We're going to be throwing, what's the best way to put it, like everything at it to see what could be done, because we have come to understand from all of this work that a lot of practices have to be employed in an area. So we're going to be helping communities understand sort of the neighborhood scale approach and help them see those specific projects. I hope that answers your question well enough, Jerry.
you. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right. So I think next question from Alex Hasha is understanding that this is modeling it, modeling, and they're necessarily statistical. If we leave aside the uncertainty in precipitation volumes, what are the other key sources of uncertainty in the hydrologic model for water drainage? And how does the degree of uncertainty compare to meteorological models? Basically, just putting in the perspective of if Milton were to use this in their climate action plan and be able to communicate this with the community, what are the things that would drive uncertainty in this model relative to just the uncertainty of individual rain events?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The uncertainty associated with climate change projections, we have found sort of different ways to factor that into this project, but there are uncertainties associated with changes in land use patterns, with changes in imperviousness that may occur with changes in land use, that may changes of other changes in the built environment, changes in infrastructure, drainage infrastructure, or stormwater infrastructure improvements projects that may occur, some of which may result in additional flooding. Those changes have not been factored into the current version of the model. We are factoring in the infrastructure conditions for the future climate projections or the future modeling scenarios that we have shown. We are assuming land use and imperviousness and drainage infrastructure to be the same as they are today. So there are likely to be uncertainties in what that could be in the future. And there are certainly opportunities to include that and in future phases, but that is not something that we are currently looking at. The current project is looking at how to bound uncertainties associated with climate change and future rainfall projections.
Right.
Can I ask a follow-up? Because that wasn't really what I was asking.
Apologies. Go ahead.
I think I understood that you are modeling given no changes in the built environment. And I'm just curious, how accurate are hydrological models? Like I have a background in climate modeling, but I've never worked with hydrological models. And is it like physics where you can get these things right within 1%, or is it more like predicting weather for next month where it's plus or minus 100%?
So we're using, and Johnny will jump in after I start this answer. As she mentioned, we're using those USGS gauges, Alexander, to calibrate the model and then verify the model. And so what we're doing is we're matching, gosh, and Johnny, we shouldn't have deleted slide 20. What we're doing is we're matching how those gauges respond to precipitation events. So when you look at those gauges, you see the line raise, right? It like goes up and it raises and then it goes down, and we're seeing how well the model matches each of those points. And we were able to get in within EPA's recommended criteria, which is less than a 10% difference. And many of our points were within about a 2 to 4% difference. I think one was closer to the 10.
Yeah. So and so all of those gauges that we that I had in one of the slides that we presented actually were the USGS stream flow gauges that we calibrated the model to. And those were all, we looked at two parameters for calibration. We matched the peak flow as well as the peak flow, the timing of the peak, as well as the volume. So we actually looked at three calibration parameters. And then we looked at matching, as Jenny explained, the meter data to the modeled data. And we looked at, and what we got was within plus minus 10% based on that EPA recommendation for model calibration validation. And then it was less than 5% at many locations.
Thank you very much.
All right. So there's a two-part question from Renee. One is that they've, let's get back to the exact language. Some of the work they've been doing with their local conservation commission has been overruled by Mass DEP when it comes to building in floodplains areas and near vernal pools. So how might they be able to help with flooding when they're kind of overridden in some of those developments? And then, sorry, it's in two separate parts. And is there somewhere where they can find out what the critical assets are for their town to kind of review that map? Is that going to be made available at some point?
Well, the second question, I believe NEPRA has that mapping available for each community, if I'm not incorrect. So those are available. Critical, yeah, Anna's, I see, jumped on.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. The critical assets were provided by communities, and they're usually a fair amount of overlap with towns' hazard mitigation plans or their HMP data. But if you have any specific questions about the data that is included in that, I'm happy to answer any questions about how we put that data together and share it out with people.
I think, the plan is if people wanted it, we can certainly share it, right? This is, yeah.
Mhm.
And then the first question's a little more tricky to answer. Looking at Indrani too.
I think it's a really critical question, one of which I think we're at a crossroads also in being able to answer, because it's really sort of the question of how much policy needs to change and needs to be effective for making these flood mitigation projects happen. And I think we are noticing, we have observed that there are some of the regulatory hurdles in designing and implementing some of those projects. And so it's certainly an extremely relevant and topical question. So thank you for bringing that up. Those are questions that are coming up in our discussions as technical engineers and designers of projects in terms of where the regulatory hurdles are. And that is something that we're hoping to build more consensus through working with state agencies, through working with you all, watershed organizations and communities across the watersheds, to be able to better understand what those hurdles are and how those can inform where our policy and regulations would need to potentially be changed to accommodate some of the really complicated challenges that we're facing in terms of dealing with the flood volumes that are likely we are likely to experience in the future. So I know that probably didn't answer your question exactly, but
And I'll add in, some of the communities in the Charles have taken some more aggressive local code approaches to enact local ordinances or bylaws and regulations. For example, the city of Watertown has a requirement that all new and redevelopment projects store on site the current 100-day storm event, which is 8.2 inches of precipitation in 24 hours. It's nearly impossible to actually design that. I won't lie, as a civil designer, but that is an aggressive measure they're taking so that is an approach some communities are taking, just to amend local code to make it more stringent than the state code. I know we're past our question time, Carrie. I don't know if we need to move on to the chat, the rooms, or how you guys want to.
I think we do. So I'm going to ask folks who still have questions, put them in the chat. We are going to circle back to them at the end of the meeting if time allows, but we will definitely answer the questions in our follow-up email to everybody who registered for this meeting. I apologize. Thank you so much for the great questions. But before our breakout rooms, I do want to give Anna a chance to sort of walk us through what the exercise is going to be, because really, it's really important for us to hear from you and be able to incorporate that into the project as it moves forward. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Anna.
Okay, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So I wanted to, before we get into our breakout rooms, just walk everyone through some of the maps that we've created from this process and sort of explain a little bit, because there's a lot of data going on here. So we've broken the watershed up into three areas for tonight. So this is sort of looking at the most downstream area of the Neponset. This is Boston Harbor, sort of up in this corner. And then we have Milton and parts of Dedham and Westwood and Boston in here as well. And what I really want to go over with people is um, sort of how we're looking at the geographic layout of all of these factors that were spoken about earlier in terms of things that are affecting green infrastructure and the flooding that we're expected to see. So if we zoom in here, we're sort of in Dedham. I want to take everyone through this. This yellow area is representative of the environmental justice block groups that were incorporated into the model. So any areas in yellow are those environmental justice population areas. And then this dark blue is the current water feature. So this is Mother Brook here, and we have sort of the Neponset coming up through here, and other streams and tributaries are in this dark blue color. This light blue color is representative of the FEMA 100-year floodplain. So this is our current 100-year FEMA floodplain extent in this light blue color. And then this dark, this red color, let me zoom in just really quick. This red color represents the modeled output 2070 10-year storm. So in the future, looking at a more frequent flooding event and looking at the extent of that flooding. And so this sort of red area here where my cursor is area that the model has predicted will be flooded during the 2070 10-year storm. And these striped areas over here are the 2070 100-year storm. So less frequent event and a little bit more of that extent. And anywhere you see this sort of dark red color, that is an area where both the current floodplain, the current FEMA floodplain, and the future prediction based on the model is showing flooding extents. So we have this dark red color anywhere they're overlapped, and then these lighter red areas, for example, over here, or these areas right here that we see that are a lighter red color represent additional flooding extents that we expect to see based on the results of the model. And you can see here, we've just put the houses. So these little white dots are all homes, most likely, or other building footprints. You see, we have a couple other buildings here. The one thing to note about the maps is the roads, just to help people sort of orient themselves, are on top of the flooding layers. So when we see, but when we see a lot of flooding on other sides of roads or transportation, like we see these train tracks here, and there's flooding around them, we don't, the roads have been placed on top just to help you sort of visualize the connectivity that's happening here. But we want to be mindful of the fact that when we see sort of flooding extents on either side of a road, we don't necessarily know that that will be passable. It's just that the map has been symbolized that way. And so all of these dots here are various types of critical infrastructure. There is a little key on all of the maps to indicate the overarching group. So just to not have so many different kinds of symbols, we've sort of grouped them a little bit to make it a little bit more easy. But things like community assets and vulnerable populations, these are things like schools, daycare centers, we have health and medical, so we have pharmacies and hospitals, things like that, public safety, food and shelter, so grocery stores, emergency shelters, things like that. So if you have any questions again about what those particular locations are, there's a key in the corner. And you can zoom in here and look around. So I want to get back to where we're looking in Dedham. So these, as I said, this map represents sort of the factors that we were looking at to build this rubric. And then if we look at this map, this is a map, hopefully my screen is catching up with people, of the catchments that were analyzed, and we gave them a score based on the factors that you just heard about in the presentation. So sort of looking at where we think areas that might be worth future investigation are. So the scoring rubric is out of 3. So that's the maximum score that we can see. And here, if we zoom into this sort of area again around Mother Brook in Dedham, we see that this is catchment 42 with a score of 2.9. This slash just designates the score for that catchment. So this is a really high scoring area. And that means, according to the scoring rubric that Weston and Sampson created, we think that this is an area that might benefit from some green infrastructure solutions. And as you can see, we have, if you zoom in, a lot of areas here where we have both an overlap of the current floodplain, right, and future flooding, and then areas where that is extending past the current floodplain based on the model. So with that overview, I just wanted to walk people through what they will be looking at. And I think with that, we are ready to head into breakout groups.
All right, I'm just going to share a slide to show.
I will stop sharing so that you can share.
All right, so so we'd really like to get some feedback from you. So we are going to break out into 3 rooms based on geography. You can choose whichever room you want to go into. Each room will have a set of maps similar to what Anna just showed us. And we'd like to know if there are any particular neighborhoods or areas in your community that you're particularly worried about when it comes to flooding, or whether you're surprised by some of the projections that the model is concluding or suggesting. Ian is going to give us the option to enter the rooms, and then each of the facilitators there will be able to zoom around the map based on places that you'd like to look, and we'll happily take notes on.
Hey, Carrie and NEPRA team, at the end of our breakout session, we had a question, which was, is there a way to get to the maps that we were sharing today so that folks can look at them? And I said, I got cut off in the middle about the viewer, but perhaps that's something we could share out at the Q&A.
We are definitely planning on sharing it out in our follow-up email. We will share out links to these static maps so people can take a closer look at them, and as well as answers to any questions that we haven't gotten to. So yes, everybody will be getting a follow-up email with more information, and we do hope that everybody will sign up for updates on this project. And you can go, I'm putting it in the chat now, go to our website, our project website, and sign up there. Everybody who registered is going to get a follow-up email from us tomorrow, and we'll include the recording as soon as that's ready, as well as the maps. And we do hope that you'll continue to take a look at them, zoom into your neighborhood, zoom into neighborhoods that you frequent, and definitely let us know what you're concerned about, and what would your priorities be. So our next steps are, after we send that follow-up email, are really just to continue on with this work and really working with your communities to find some of these strategies that they can implement, maybe get some projects into the ground. We will be applying for another grant to continue this work. And we hope that this is interesting to you, and that you will stay involved, and that you will keep in touch with us. With that, I don't know what time. We've got 3 minutes. Does anybody have any other questions they'd like to pose? And you can always email me. My email address is up here on the screen. Email me anytime with questions. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time tonight. We really appreciate it.